Hello, and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast. On today's podcast, we've got our Patreon questions from the Austrian Grand Prix. We actually have quite a lot of them, so check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast to sign up and have the chance to ask us your questions. As ever, the Paddock Pass podcast is brought to you by Fly Racing and Renthal Street, so check out them for your protection on the road and also the parts for your bike. It's also brought to you by KTM, and a little bit of a special treat. We've got David. I'm just going to call you an Orangeman, Dave, because you've got your KTM loan bike. You've been out to the KTM factory and the Motorhall Museum, so you're full on KTM this week, I think.
I am full on KTM. No, I mean it was really good. I was shown around the KTM's racing department, which is very, very interesting. In part because it's they've got all of the disciplines together. So they've got the MotoGP bikes in with the Red Bull rookie bikes, in with the Moto3 bikes, and in with the motocross bikes and the rally bikes and the enduro bikes. And it was really, really good. It was really interesting. Also, sort of hearing about the organisation and the way that they've opened things up, tried to help people communicate between all of the various departments and that sort of thing, and a little bit about the technology, about sort of like they succeeded with the steel chassis, and so they're now shifting to this carbon fiber chassis, and the way that they're sort of like viewing that again, it's really, really interesting. And then in the afternoon, I went to KTM's Moto Hall, which I was told several times. First of all, it wasn't a museum, and then they won an award for the museum. So now you can call it a museum. But it's much more than a museum. It's sort of like you see much more about you see the history of of KTM, of the brand. They've got they've got all of their winning bikes. When you actually see the number of trophies that they've won, I think they're the most successful European manufacturer in motorsports. I think they're the most successful motorsports manufacturer in the world because they've won trophies in so many disciplines. Not just motocross, obviously, rally, enduro, women's motocross, junior motocross, Moto3, Moto2. It's been across so many different things. So that was interesting. There was a lot about the background of that. There was a lot of the sort of they're showcasing their engineering as well. They've got lots of dismantled engines and stuff on display, which is really good. Sort of actually broken apart, and of course, lots of their the history of their models through the years, which is really interesting. And they've got like a couple of prototypes of the Dukes, for example, and you can really see how the prototype went to the 1390 Duke, to the current Duke. So yeah, no, it was very enjoyable. Thank you very much to KTM for sort of like showing me around and giving me a free ticket. So yeah, but highly recommended. Also, one of the I was talking to one of the marketing people, and she was telling me that they'd had a bunch of actually Dutch motorcyclists come through that morning. Because it's extremely, if you are going to Spielberg, if you are going to the Red Bull Ring, or even if you're just going to Austria for a holiday on the bike, it's really convenient. It's quite close to the German border, and there's a dedicated bike park, and there's a restaurant next to it, and all the rest of it. So no, it's really, really good. I really enjoyed it.
That's great, Dave. It sounds like there's not a museum, a curated history hall of collection of KTMs is definitely well worth the visit. And Neil,
100%.
Obviously I couldn't call David a busy Orangeman, but I can call you a busy Orangeman. You've been absolutely flat out. Lots of extra content on Patreon, including what we're actually going to play in today's show as well, an interview with Ai Ogura.
Exactly. Yes, I thought it would probably be worth giving Ai a little bit of airtime because I think a few people have been maybe a little disparaging about him with his performance in the press conference on Thursday. He's a little bit shy and introverted, I think, when he's in front of lots of cameras. But when he's just chatting one-on-one, he's actually like a really nice, intelligent guy and comes across quite well. And he's obviously been in the news quite a bit with his contract to MotoGP being confirmed just before the Austrian Grand Prix. So, yeah, we have an interview in this show with Ai to run pretty soon.
Yeah, and we'll get to it when we get to our questions from Patreon as well. But just before we do that, we had our rider of the Austrian Grand Prix poll as well on Patreon, and Pecco Bagnaia came out on top of that, 61% of the vote, and then 22% for Marc Marquez. So pretty commanding victory at the weekend for Pecco, pretty commanding victory in our Patreon poll as well. But we're going to move straight into our questions from Patreon. So like I said, check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast to sign up and give yourself the chance to be able to ask questions to this. So one of the questions that came in was from Craig Stanyon, and it was basically about Trackhouse and whether or not they've actually improved at all compared to where R&F were last year. And then the other part of his question is whether or not we expected more from them as well, from the perspective of being able to bring in big sponsors or US media, and whether or not they've really met what we expected as their goals. So whichever you want to take that away first.
Well, have they improved in terms of their results? I think it's really difficult. I mean, they're pretty much where they were last year as RNF. They've had a much more peaceful year, if you like. There hasn't been quite the turmoil, so much turmoil around them. I think it's fair to say that Raul Fernandez has definitely made a step forward this year. Miguel Oliveira just doesn't seem to. He hasn't been able to really gel with the Aprilia. Raul Fernandez has got a little bit better, but it seems like there's been more of a focus on just integrating with the Aprilia team rather than anything else. But I don't think they're anywhere near where they were hoping to be at the start of the year. I think they were hoping to be, to be much more competitive. But then if you look at what Aleix and Maverick have done, they've been similar. They've been brilliant at times. They've won races, but they've also been completely nowhere. So it's just really, really difficult to say where they are.
Yeah, I think last year the RNF boys were 16th to 20th in the World Championship. Obviously, a great deal of that was due to Miguel Oliveira having a horrible run of injuries and being really unfortunate, having one of the more unfortunate seasons in living memory. And this year, their riders are 13th and 16th in the championship. So there's not really a massive difference, as Dave said. I think last year, Oliveira was a lot more competitive on a year-old machine. This year, I think he's been one of the disappointments of the season. I really thought he could be regularly challenging to become the top Aprilia rider. And we haven't seen that from him really at all, with one or two minor exceptions. I think Sachsenring was the only highlight we've really had from Oliveira so far. New owners coming in, largely the same personnel, but I think it's going to take a while for them to completely suss out what is going on and what sort of is needed to become a successful team. And yet then the situation with Aprilia, obviously. I mean, any team, never mind a satellite team that isn't running Ducatis at the moment, is kind of on a hiding to nothing, so to speak. And Trackhouse are just one of the teams that are kind of a victim to the current set of circumstances in MotoGP, because it's really tough for anyone that's not running the Bologna bike.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the big things when you look at it, that if you've got Raul Fernandez on a year-old bike, when you're on a bike that's so inconsistent as well, even the factory team show that it really is very difficult to be able to try and do anything, especially if you're not on the Ducatis, like you said, Neil.
Yeah, and the other part of the question about, have they made the impact in terms of, having this big US link? Have they been able to attract anyone? For a start, it's really difficult to see from the outside, from this side of the pond, from not being actually inside the team. and you sort of, it's one of those things which there could be lots and lots of things going on in the background that we know nothing about, and we won't find out about until next year. But you do sort of like get the sense that they were hoping for better results to be able to sell this to the team, because if you look at their social media in terms of the rest of the rest of their sports, obviously they're doing much better in NASCAR, and it's much easier to sell. So I think the real test of it comes next year.
Yeah, and one of the questions we had from Jeff Richards was about next year and the rider lineup, and obviously Trackhouse has been one of the most talked about seats on the grid, and Jeff's asking us, did Trackhouse make a huge mistake? And he's not talking about Ai Ogura, he's talking about not picking Joe Roberts over Raul Fernandez, and saying, like, if Raul's on the outside of the points, does it make a big difference if you had a Joe on the bike?
I think in that respect, Trackhouse are kind of victims of the circumstances of the Aprilia factory team. I think it was pretty tantamount that Aprilia had at least one rider continuing from this year on into 2025, because the factory lineup is completely new. I think that's not ideal. In an ideal world, they probably would have had Jorge Martin coming in and Maverick Vinales staying, and maybe both of Trackhouse riders staying. Davide Brivio said to us on the Thursday in Austria that the original plan was to keep both Miguel and Raul for next year, just to have that continuity in place. The fact that Miguel decided to leave to go to Pramac Yamaha, I think is pretty tough. And yeah, I can see Aprilia sort of having a bit of a shaky start to the year next year, because it's having 3 new names come in is going to be difficult. And yes, really, they are gaining one of the most talented guys in MotoGP in Jorge Martin, but that's a big sort of it's a big change, a lot of uprooting, and quite a few technical staff will be changing hands as well. Aleix is taking his crew chief to Honda. Jorge Martin's bringing Daniele Romagnoli across from Ducati. So yeah, I think Trackhouse were, they couldn't really get rid of both of their riders. Once Miguel left, it was imperative that they kept Raul. And would you have Raul in normal circumstances over a really talented fast Moto2 rider? I'm not sure, really. Looking at where he's at in his 3rd year. So yeah, I think that's my answer for it.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And like I said, Neil, we've got your Ai Ogura interview to play in the show, so we're going to come to that now. But just, Neil, what's your big takeaways from sitting down with Ai?
Well, it's probably that he's never going to talk to me ever again, because we did this interview on the Friday night in Austria when everything was just looking so good and so rosy for Ai. He was the absolute class of the field in Moto2 on Friday. I think he was faster than pretty much everyone, bar maybe 3 or 4 names on old tires than the other competitors were on new tires. You just had to listen to the top 2 in Moto2 after the race finished on Sunday. Immediately they were like, we got really lucky that Ai was injured, because if he was here, he would have cleaned up and cleared off and won this race by a very comfortable margin. We did this interview on the Friday night. Ai then went out and broke a couple of bones in his right hand on Saturday morning. So he's probably going to be looking at me as a bit of a jinx from now on, I would say. Unfortunately so, but Ai, if you're listening, I'm sorry, and I hope that you're healing well, and we see you back in Aragon.
Just before we play the interview as well, Neil, obviously Ogura getting the Trackhouse seat was one of the big talking points once it was confirmed. Just when you look at him as a rider, obviously Moto2, he's been really strong this year, very little to choose between him and Sergio Garcia. The one weakness is probably qualifying for Ogura. And in terms of his racecraft, he's shown himself Moto3, the first year in Moto2 as well, to be a really good racer, and a guy that everyone expected to have a chance to get to MotoGP. But obviously, Trackhouse came as a bit of a surprise whenever all that momentum came.
Yeah. I think we were asking again, Davide Brivio, on the eve of the Austrian Grand Prix, why he chose Ai and why he chose him over Joe Roberts. That was a repeated question that he had to field. And he pointed largely to his tenacity. I mean, he is quite a tenacious rider in Moto2, comes through from way back. He is a fighter. I think he was 17th at Le Mans, qualified and finished 2nd. He was 10th in Barcelona, way back in the opening laps. He came through to win. He does have these kind of incredible races where he manages to pass 10, 15 riders. And I would say maybe the sort of thing you would be worried about would be this kind of situation that he found himself in Austria, where things are looking so good, and it's his moment, his time to shine, and it gets away from him somehow. And you think back to 2022 and that crash at Sepang when he was leading the race on the last lap, and that win would have put him, considerably ahead of Augusto Fernandez going into the final race, and he crashed out, lost his advantage completely. Maybe there's question marks in that department for Ai. So yeah, it's going to be tough for him coming back in Aragon with the injury that he has, and then the races come pretty thick, thick and fast after that. So it's going to be a big ask for Ai to come back from this moment. But I think the top of the Moto2 Championships showed that no one's really enjoying a consistent moment at the moment.
Yeah, because I kind of look at Moto2 and there's very little for me to choose really between him and Sergio Garcia. They've both had a couple of tough weekends. They've both had really strong weeks. So both of those guys you'd like to see on a MotoGP grid. But Ogura is going to get that chance. And like you said, Neil, you had 15 minutes with him before it went bad for him in Austria. But great to have Ai on the podcast.
Well, I'm delighted to say I am joined by Ai Ogura here today. Ai, it's been an interesting weekend for you so far. We're speaking on Friday at the Austrian Grand Prix. Mm-hmm. You've had a brilliant day of practice, topping both of the Moto2 sessions. And we had confirmation yesterday that you're going to MotoGP next year. Mm-hmm. I guess that must be like a dream come true for you.
Exactly like you said, it's a dream come true. As a rider, the main goal is always to be a MotoGP rider. And finally I could make the last step. I'm very happy for this. I can't thank enough to all the people, and yeah, I'm happy. And I talk about today also.
No, just about the MotoGP in general. Okay. I mean, you had maybe more than one offer to go to MotoGP, if I understand correctly. But what convinced you to go with Trackhouse next year?
Well, first I wanted to say that if I could go up with Honda, well, I had a choice, but if I could go up with Honda, that was the best for me also, of course, because I grew up with Honda. I started with them in Asia Talent Cup. Until now, I got support by Honda, so I'm still Honda rider. So, of course, if I can go up with MotoGP with Honda, is the best. But at the same time, I have to think about my future, and what I can judge about the MotoGP is only the result or the video. There's no more. So look like Aprilia is stronger bike they have now. So that was my decision.
Yeah. Also, Trackhouse now managed by Davide Brivio. Mm-hmm. When you look at some of the riders he brought into MotoGP, mm-hmm. they went on to do fantastic things. The likes of Vinales, Rins, Joan Mir as well. I mean, that's another sign that you're going to be working with the right people, the top people.
Yeah, the name you mentioned is too big at the moment for me, so I'm a bit nervous that I can make same things as that guys or not. So, but of course it's nice that Bolivia choose me, and I'm really happy for this. And the team and the bike look strong, so I just can't wait to start.
Yeah. I think you've had the chance to maybe step up to MotoGP in previous years. Mm-hmm. What was it that made you decide now is the time? Obviously, you're having a fantastic year in Moto2, but do you just feel more ready to step up this time?
I feel more ready now than 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was fighting for the title, but in the practice, I was not always inside the top 5, let's say. I'm average like top 5 to top 10, and in the race I can be there, but I could be there, but that wasn't enough for me. And this year I think I performed better than 2022, and I feel that this year there's a lot of chances to get the title. So for this reason, I decided to go MotoGP.
Yeah. When we saw you in the press conference on Thursday, we heard you're the first rider that competed in the Asia Talent Cup mm-hmm. that will be in MotoGP. Can you maybe just tell us a little about what role the Asia Talent Cup played in your career? I mean, it was quite an important part of your rise, right?
Yeah, till they start Asia Talent Cup, there was nothing that Honda, nothing that young Asia rider can do, because there's no way to MotoGP. And well, I was lucky about my age, because exactly when I was at like 14, 15 years old, they started, and I was really lucky for this. And well, when you make a good result there, you can go to Rookies Cup or the CV, and the loot is there. So without the Asia Talent Cup, I would be nowhere. So happy, lucky,
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, we see you with your leathers. You have the number 74, Daijiro Kato's number on your leathers. I'm just wondering, what kind of role did he play in your childhood, your love of motorcycles as a kid?
Of course, it's easy to say Daijiro is my hero, but I don't really know about him, because as a kid, when I was watching MotoGP, was already, let's say, Valentino era, and there is Casey and Jorge and Danny and Daijiro. I think for all the Japanese people, he's the best. They can feel that he's the best Japanese rider ever, and I feel it too. And well, I just like him, but it's shame that when I was a kid, he's not there anymore. And well, he's anyway, he's the best Japanese rider ever. So that's the reason. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and he had the potential to maybe be a future MotoGP champion, I think. Yeah, I think a lot of people have that point of view.
Well, that's the everybody looking for. So it's not easy, and MotoGP is another level. I think there is big names there. So yeah, we see.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been easy.
Yeah.
You've obviously, I think you live in Spain, right?
Yeah.
And you live just outside Barcelona.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big sacrifice coming from Japan, moving across to Europe, and you've been in Barcelona for quite a few years, right? Can you talk a little bit about the sacrifices you had to make to come and race in the World Championship, because you had to basically leave your family, leave your friends, and start a new life here?
I started to live in Spain back in 2019, I think, when I started to GP. And the beginning is not easy, of course, because the culture is completely different, and you is nobody. Well, but at that point I was lucky, because I shared the flat with other 3 riders from the Honda Team Asia, and they prepare everything, flat and everything. So for this, I think to be in Honda Team Asia is really lucky. And of course, first few years were not easy, but now it's okay for me.
Yeah. Does it feel like home now, Spain?
Not that much, but not that much, but it's okay.
There are worse places to live, right?
Yeah.
So at least the weather's good.
Yeah, at least the weather is fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just looking at this year, it's been a fantastic adaptation to the empty helmets MSI squad. I mean, you and Sergio are first and second in the championship, both fighting for the championship, both fighting for podiums most weekends. I have to ask, what makes this team so good? How can they, in their first year in Moto2, be first and second in the championship?
Well, I know that you want to know the reason, but Sergio is first and I'm second in the standings. That shows everything, I think. I think the guys walking here is really motivated. They have a lot of passion for the motorcycle. I really feel it. And as a rider, it's always nice to work with this kind of mechanics. So just the atmosphere is awesome, and also the technique side, they are of course a professional. So I think that's the reason. But I think Sergio is really strong rider, and I think I'm doing well this season, and it's all matching. And now, so that's the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're obviously physically 100% this year. Something last year that you couldn't say. Can you tell us just how bad was your injury at the start of 2023? When I heard the news, some people were saying it could threaten your career. It was a very serious injury, right?
That injury I got in last year was really serious, but I think I said many times already, but after Jerez last year, I had no problem on my wrist anymore. Just to get back the feeling was the most tough point on the last year, because other guys did 1, 2, 3 races already. Also in the winter test, so I missed everything, and to catch up these riders in 5-6 races wasn't easy for me, and I think injury wasn't a problem, but just the bike time was the main issue for me last year.
Yeah. You were always playing catch up, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy now to look at the team's decision to switch to Boscoscuro and think, wow, what a fantastic decision. But I remember at the end of last year, a lot of people, myself included, we thought, oh, it's a bit risky when it was announced at Valencia last November, I think it was. What was your honest impression when you heard, because it was quite a late announcement that you would be riding Boscoscuro this year. Were you thinking, oh, it's a bit of a risk, or?
Well, first, I think Sergio and me was really lucky, because team let Lida decide which chassis we're going for the 24. So for this part, I think we were really lucky, because we could choose Kalex, or we could also choose we also could choose a Bosco, and we had an option, and finally we both decided to go Bosco. Of course, I was not really sure at that moment, but when you decide, it's already done, and you must go with this bike. So after I decided everything, I was really free. I mean the mind side, but of course till start 24 I was a bit worried, but well, finally we start good the season, and we are first and second now. So I think that was a correct choice.
Yeah. Did you feel comfortable on the Pirellis and the Boscoscuro from the first moment, or did it take some time to find that optimum feeling?
Well, for me, the start with Boscoscuro and the Pirelli was really smooth. First test for 2024 was in Jerez, and the circuit I like, of course. So I think also I was lucky in the spot. I start really smooth, and of course there was a lot of unknown things, especially first 2-3 races. So we could not adapt like we wanted, but race by race we getting the feeling, and we're both strong now. So yeah,
absolutely. Just a few more questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you still have a partnership with HRC. You obviously left Honda Team Asia at the end of last year. So how does that work exactly? Are you still under contract with the factory?
This year, yeah.
Yeah, this year. Okay, right. And can you imagine a situation? I know it's very difficult to say, but you've always been a Honda rider. Sometime in the future, can you imagine a situation where maybe you'll be a Honda rider again?
After I signed Trackhouse, it sounds really strange, but it's one of the target, because I grow up with Honda, and maybe I can finish with my career with Honda. Is the best, no? I think so. Of course, if Honda Honda ask me again, of course I want to go there. So let's see, because it's not only in my hands. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, and hopefully Honda can take a step up in that time as well. Just looking at the final 10 races of the season that we have, you're in a fantastic place in the championship. Are you just looking at Sergio as the big rival for the championship this year, or are you still thinking of Roberts, Aldeguer, Alonso, Lopez? I mean, how do you see the championship fight?
At the moment, clearly the the Sergio is the rider to beat because he's front of me. So this is clear, but I think depend on the circuit. The strong rider is big change, no? Like example, like high speed circuit, maybe Joe and Fermin is really strong. Heartbreaking circuit, maybe Sergio and Alonso is strong. Then I cannot guess really right now because many riders go fast and they perform really well this season, and I feel that the rider is really strong now. So I cannot judge anything right now, but there's 4 or 5 riders to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final question, we know you're a quiet guy. When you go to MotoGP, there's going to be a lot more attention on you. You're going to have to speak to us journalists a lot more, I'm afraid to say. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to take that next step where you're going to have to be more in front of cameras and journalists and things like that?
Well, if the guys ask me to do, I have to do. So of course I will, but I don't need to change my character. They ask me and I answer. So that's my job, no? Like everybody said, and I'm ready for this. I think. Yeah.
You just have to be yourself. That's
yeah.
That's all you can do.
That's the main priority. So.
Absolutely. Well, Ai Ogura, it's been absolutely lovely having you on the Paddock Pass podcast. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great to have Ai Ogura on the podcast, and now we're going to get to the rest of our Patreon questions. We've got a range of topics to cover: the rider market, Marc Marquez, track attendance, the profile of fans. So we've got plenty to get through. Let's go straight to Marc Marquez because he was the big talking point at the weekend. And a question came in from Racing Armchair, and it was started off basically just by saying that if people can't understand why Ducati signed Marc to their factory team to be on the GP25 next year, this weekend perfectly showed that, because Pecco dominates the weekend, but all that we want to talk about is Marc, because he crashes, drops down the order, still recovers to finish in 4th. He's just entertainment out there, and he's just a bigger draw than anyone else, and that's what makes him exciting for Ducati.
Yeah, but I mean, we said this after Mugello as well, because at Mugello it was really clear that when Marc was fighting with Enea Bastianini, that Bastianini's bike was just simply quicker than Marc, and there was nothing that Marc could do, and you could see Marc trying to do everything he possibly could to get past. This is, I mean, overtaking is it's impossible in MotoGP unless there's a number 93 on the front of the bike. It really is. Just that he's a special rider. He still is a special rider, and he's able to stay with the GP24s. And I wonder. Because Marc is still using the GP23 ride height device. He's using the old ride height device, not the new ride height device. And the new ride height device is something it drops the bike a little bit lower. It gives you a sort of, an extra 10th out of the corner or something. And that is what makes a difference. If he has that, then I think we could see Marc starts to really mix it up in the front. But let's see whether they get them or not.
Just for you, Neil, we had a question in from Seth McCann, and he was asking whether or not we overestimate Marc's strengths and his power still, or do we underestimate the rest of the top riders on the grid right now as well? So a little bit of, does Marc get too much credit? Do the other riders not get enough credit?
I think this year has proved just how strong both Pecco and Jorge Martin are. And a lot of people were predicting that Marc coming on a Ducati would immediately result in him clearing off and saunter into the world title at ease. It hasn't transpired that way. I do think that the difference between the 24s and the 23 on which Marc is currently competing is quite pronounced. And as Dave just said, you just have to kind of look at onboard footage of Marc when he's following some of the GP24s to see the advantage that they have coming out of the turns. So no, I think I think certainly this year has brought into focus just how good the top two in the championship are. But I also think that we have not overestimated Marc's powers. I think Marc is doing a pretty sensational job. He's consistently the top GP23, and the fact that he's even able to mix it with the GP24s says a lot about his prowess. So the real answer to that question will come in 2025 when he steps up into Pecco Bagnaia's team. But yeah, no, I don't think we're overestimating him at all.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those situations where, again, at the weekend, we were able to really see that as well, because for someone like Marc to do what he did, I think he still ended up pretty much the same time that won the race last year, even with that crash. So I think that, again, gives another indication of what kind of a job he was doing. Dave, we had a question in from Adam Cole as well, just asking about the differences between the GP23 and the GP24, but it was more about whether or not there'll be any racetracks this year where Marc or someone else with GP23 are able to overcome the deficit to the 24 and be able to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there will be tracks where, for example, I mean, the really big differences in acceleration. I think Austria was the one track where that you're going to see the biggest difference between the two. I think Misano will see quite a lot of difference between the two. Maybe Motegi. I mean, we'll go to a place like Phillip Island, and there won't be there won't be that much difference between the bikes. And you've got to think that Marc can win there. It's going to be interesting to see Aragon as well. Aragon is another track where there's only really one corner where the ride height device makes a big difference, which is out of the bus stop and down the back straight, around onto the front straight. Again, like the ride height device helps there, but you can carry so much speed through that corner that it makes less difference. So yeah, I mean, Marc is going to be on the podium at Aragon. I just don't know what position yet. So yes, there will definitely be tracks where you can make a difference, where the difference will be less, and where the GP23 will be at the front. It's going to be interesting again to see, for example, Digia, Fabio Di Giannantonio in a place like Indonesia, for example, where he was quite strong last year as well. So let's see. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. As Neil has said, there is a really big difference between the GP24 and the GP23 this year. The GP23 might get a few updates, which will bring it a little bit closer. Especially the ride height device. But apart from that, I think there's there's still one or two tracks where the ride height device is going to make less of a difference.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic, and that's the rider market. We had a question in from Gary just asking us to go through who everyone has signed. So Gary, we're actually going to post that on Patreon. Dave's going to do that pretty soon to be able to give everyone the full list of where everyone's at and what the situations are. One of the big questions we had in, or one of the big areas in the rider market people wanted to talk about, Neil, was Fermin Aldeguer. And none of it seemed to be particularly positive for Per Fermin. It was all, how can Ducati get out of signing this guy? It's almost as if the whole world has just forgotten that Aldeguer came in and really impressed everyone with Dunlop tyres. He's clearly struggled to adapt the Pirellis. But why is there no performance clause for Ducati to get out of having to commit to Fermin Aldeguer? That seemed to be a question we got in from Martin, from DJ Purchase, from quite a few others. I think Greg was another one that had a question in like that as well. So a lot of people coming in with those questions, Neil.
I think, I mean, first of all, we're not exactly sure if there is no performance clause, but I think that no one really could have envisioned the recent struggles of Fermin. I think it's important we put this into context. Firstly, Fermin had a couple of very bad rounds. He was way off the pace at Silverstone. He was way off the pace in Austria. One of those circuits you would expect him to be fast, Silverstone. One you would not, which was Austria, where he's always struggled in the past in Moto2. It's not an unmitigated disaster this season. It's not like Fermin is, 15th in the championship and is having a horrible time. He's still in the championship fight, and I think that he still is going to be a big player in the championship. And I'm still waiting for that moment for everything to just click with his setting this year. if it does, I think he's capable of going on a run like he did at the end of last year. However, that's not to dress up the fact that it has been a disappointing year. I think everyone was expecting Fermin to be the title winner this year. And especially in Austria, I mean, no point in the weekend did he look fast. No point in the weekend did you think he's going to be fighting for the top six. And really the kind of momentum that he had built up just before the summer break when he was fighting for victory in Barcelona. He was probably one of the fastest riders in Mugello. Then he had this weird issue with his neck, couldn't qualify, got taken out of the race. Then Assen, he should have won, but he kept on exceeding track limits, got a long lap penalty. Germany, he won. So you thought, okay, here's this kind of momentum he's building up. Also Barcelona before that, he was leading before he crashed out in the long lap penalty. So, there were races consistently where he was among the fastest guys. And he just hasn't really been able to go on and kick on from that. And this was particularly puzzling because there was a test at Aragon just before Austria where he was the fastest guy. I think he was under the lap record. He was one of the fastest guys, and was feeling fantastic. So yeah, strange. Him and his team boss, Luca Bosco, were pointing to the fact that he was pretty much either bottom or second bottom of the top speed charts in Austria. He's a tall, gangly lad. He's maybe about 8, 9, 10 kilos heavier than some of his Moto2 rivals like Garcia and Ogura. But still, I don't think that is solely to blame for the kind of the lack of performance that he showed. So yeah, it's a puzzling one. But I still don't think it's as bad as it looks.
Yeah, I kind of look at it and think that Fermin has probably still showed himself to be the fastest rider in the class. He's had, 2 poles, 6 front rows. Every time he's been on the front row, he's given himself a chance to win those races. You mentioned about Barcelona, Neil. That was probably for me what a lot of people use as their standout memory of his season for it all going wrong. But it's also easy to forget he's 19 and he's a young 19. He only turned 19 in April. So he made his Moto2 World Championship debut at 17, having never really had that white hot competitive class to race in, because when you look back at his career, he was in CEV Moto2, which is a very poor class, particularly whenever he came into it. He was in the stock 600 class, jumped on to the speed up, and then just wiped the floor with everyone and did a great job, moved on to the World Championship. This is the first time in his career he's really actually had a tough time, a challenge to overcome. But he's 19, and if you've got that raw speed, I don't know why you wouldn't want to take a chance on him. And I really think that Ducati, it's either going to work really well or it's going to work really badly for them. But he's 19, he's going to be 20 by the time we get to Qatar next year. He's worth taking a punt on because he could be something special. Anyone that jumps onto a Moto2 bike, puts it on the front row, puts it on pole in their first few rounds, they deserve to be respected for that sheer talent. And I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens with Aldeguer next year. But it's also one of those ones where you have to look at it from the perspective of you have to be realistic with your expectations for him next year as well. And he's not going to go in and win a load of Grand Prix next year. He's not going to come in, have a lot of podiums. It's just about looking at a 20-year-old kid that's having to make those steps at a bigger stage than most other riders have to do. If you look at Pedro Acosta, when he was 13, everyone knew he was a future superstar. When Fermin Aldeguer was 13, he didn't have the money to move from European Talent Cup to Moto3, so he had to go and ride a 600.
The other thing that we're seeing here is a phenomenon called recency bias, which is also known as "What have you done for me lately?" You have a couple of bad races, and people think you're not very good, and they forget that you've been on pole. They forget that you've been leading races, and if circumstances had fallen slightly differently, then maybe we wouldn't be asking these questions. But the thing is, Ducati factories, they see something in the rider, and they make these choices. They take a gamble. Again, it's also a gamble which Ducati can afford to lose. So if it doesn't work out, then no bother. They've got two riders. They've got the reigning world champion. They've got a 9 times world champion. They're doing okay for talent for the moment.
8 times world champion, Dave, but we'll
I beg your pardon. 8 times, yeah.
But yeah, just very briefly, it's we've mentioned this in the show before. This is a strategy that Ducati has employed before to sign the likes of Pecco Bagnaia, Jorge Martin, where they signed them up to a contract for the following year before that year had even got underway, and it worked okay with both of those guys. Even, you have to look at the case of Jorge Martin, where in 2020 he signed a contract with Ducati at the start of that year, then, had a couple of good races, got COVID, then was not the same rider after that. And I'm sure there was a lot of people then asking, is this guy really good enough? Have Ducati jumped the gun a little bit? I just always, no matter what happens to Fermin this year, my mind goes back to the end of last year where he looked even faster than Pedro Acosta. And that's something that you can't erase. There's not many riders that have been able to do that in any class so far, or in kind of, Moto 2 or Moto 3. So yeah, for that, Fermin I still think of Fermin as one of the kind of the biggest talents around.
Yeah, I think it's also worth looking at the switch from the Dunlops to the Pirellis. And like for me, obviously in Superbikes, we're used to the Pirelli tire, and we're used to a tire that has big differences in the performances windows, whereas with the Dunlop, it's just rock hard. You could use it all day long and set your fastest lap on lap 40, and everything was fine. And it's where for me, like in Superbikes, Sam Lowes is going from a Dunlop to a Pirelli, and all he talks about is whenever it gets really hot, he doesn't know what to expect with that tire. And I think Fermin's struggled with that a little bit as well this year, which goes hand in hand with having that inexperience as well, compared to other riders that have to go through different bikes and different things. Dave, we had a question in from TPR as well about how teams actually negotiate with riders and what happens whenever they make a decision to go with a different rider. So the instance in this was presumably Pramac and Yamaha were talking to Sergio Garcia at the same time as Jack Miller. But what happens whenever a team actually decides, right, we're going to go with Jack Miller? Do they call Sergio Garcia, or do they just stop answering the phone?
No, I mean it's a business. Everyone knows this. It's the man, and they're not talking to Sergio Garcia. They're talking to Sergio Garcia's manager, and Sergio Garcia's manager is holding out for the best deal possible. Also, it wasn't Pramac; it was Yamaha, because it's been Yamaha who's been dealing with these contracts. So yeah, at some point there's a phone call. Sorry, we decided to go with someone else. No hard feelings. Try again next time. So yeah, you can't afford to hold grudges in MotoGP, because you don't know who you're going to need in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting in the rider market to see the motivations for it as well. And it's one of those things that for us, when obviously you hear rumors, you try and figure out what's driving those rumors, and you try and figure out who's got the motivation to play a bit of hardball, who's got the motivation to try and get a deal done. And a lot of that comes down to the rider manager. If they only have one client, they need as much money as possible because they need their cut. Whereas if it's a manager with a lot of different riders, then you're able to they're probably looking out for the best interest of the rider rather than one quick contract. Neil, we had a question in from Nathan Bultman as well, and this was a little bit of a historic one as well, where a Marc Marquez and a Pecco Bagnaia super team, is it as likely to be as volcanic as Valentino Rossi and Jorge Lorenzo super team?
Well, you're referring to probably the most volcanic super team in the history of all super teams. Two of the biggest egos I think you could imagine, but then I guess you would put Marc Marquez in that camp as well. I think Pecco Bagnaia has said in a video to MotoGP that it could be either great or it could be an absolute disaster. And if you send that at this stage of the game, then I'm inclined to believe that for him it could be the latter of the two. But yeah, I think it's going to be pretty feisty. It's going to be great. It's very rare that you have two teammates fighting for the ultimate honours. And from what we've seen this year, I think Pecco Bagnaia has been the strongest rider this year. But I think from what Marc has been able to do with his current package, he'll absolutely be contending for the title next year. I have no doubt about that. So yeah, name me two teammates that have fought for a title and it's not gone completely tits up between them. I don't think it's ever happened in the history of motorsport, and I'm probably opening that up to Formula One as well. So that's why I'm interested to see what happens with Ai Ogura and Sergio Garcia in Moto 2 this year. Surely it'll get a bit nasty. Maybe it already is. But yeah, I think it is going to be volcanic. It's going to be interesting. And we know that Marc is just the kind of the master of mind games and just knows very subtle ways to get under riders' skin, and I think he's already kind of playing that role at the moment where he's pretending to be super nice and this lovely little guy. He said on the Thursday in Austria, he was asked, who would you like to see win the championship this year? And he said, obviously Pecco, because it would be great for our team, next year to have the number one plate. And, just little things like that where he's just throwing little grenades into Pecco and to see how he deals with it. And I think those are the kind of things that make the sport so interesting.
Yeah, it'd be really good to have the number one plate on the other side of the pit box and then take it off him in 12 months' time. So that's obviously not Marc's motivation. It's just for team harmony and to get the best results possible. Dave, we had a question in from Patrick Parkinson as well about the Japanese manufacturers and how likely it is that we won't see a Japanese winner in the top class this year. And just to kind of follow on from that, when do you see Honda or Yamaha actually winning a race again?
Easiest question ever.
Exactly. Excluding something really bizarre happening, weather related, because when the weather starts to go, then there's really not a lot you can. Then all bets are out the window. Basically, no, neither Honda nor Yamaha are in any position to win right now. And Honda is still trying to look for a direction. Yamaha, it feels like they've got a direction and they are actually developing. I think Yamaha are going to be in a much, much better situation next year. I think Honda will start to make progress next year, but they're still going to be, that they'll be fighting for top 10s, where next year I think Yamaha are going to be fighting for top 5s and occasional podiums. When will they win again? That's a really big question. I do think they win again before. And by win again, I mean not a wet race, not circumstances, not anything else, like a proper outright straight win. I think Yamaha will win 26, but I think there'll be a Japanese rider or a Japanese bike winning again before we change formats. This year, absolutely not. Circumstance permitting. Next year, extremely unlikely.
Yeah, because it's just over 2 years since Yamaha last won, and we'll wait and see. But I wouldn't be holding out too much hope for them. And Neil, it kind of brings us to a different question as well, and it came in from VJ, and it was about Jorge Martin moving to Aprilia for next season. Is it actually worth a factory rider from a top manufacturer like Ducati to give up the bike that can win those races to then be in the full factory team and the chance to lead that development? And what would motivate you to do that?
This is a good question. It was something that I was thinking about over the weekend. How has Jorge Martin viewed the last couple of races? Like, yes, he's been scoring good results and he's had great results for the championship, but if anything, Aprilia seem further away now than they did when he signed. They seem further away now than they did certainly last year. And yeah, it seems in one way to be a pretty crazy decision. But I mean, we've discussed this before. He was left with no other option, really. Staying with a satellite Ducati team just wasn't. He kind of backed himself into a corner that it was basically a factory team or nothing. And it was entirely understandable that he had done that because he has been one of the two strongest riders in MotoGP for the last year and a half. That means that you should be leading the factory. If you're in that situation, you should be on a proper factory wage. You should be leading development. Factories' hopes and sort of work should be based around what you can offer them on a Sunday. And by remaining in a factory team remaining in a satellite team while one of your rivals steps up and gets the factory seat above you, for a MotoGP rider's ego, that just isn't really acceptable. So, one way, Jorge had no other option, but I have to say, I have thought that in recent weeks, I would be interested to know what he's thinking. Is he a little bit worried? Surely there must be one or two alarm bells ringing because he's going from a seat which guarantees him a shot at the championship, as he's showing. He's still in the championship race, 5 points back of Bagnaia, to one where there's just a lot of question marks. And really, Aprilia have really long way to make up over the winter months to get back on an even keel with Ducati.
Yeah, the other thing is that you have to look at Aprilia. You have to look at the riders Aprilia have. Aleix Espargaro is good, but not one of the greatest riders ever. Maverick Vinales is incredibly talented from time to time, and a lot of the time he's just completely lost. Jorge Martin has proved that not only is he an incredibly talented rider, he's also incredibly consistent. He's very good at managing himself and managing his team and all the rest of it. I think Jorge Martin is a massive upgrade on their current ride, on Aprilia's current riders. So naturally, he's going to do better. And riders have massive self-belief. They truly believe that they can make the difference. And he's not going to be, Martin is always going to lose out to Pecco Bagnaia unless he's in the factory team. So he's got nothing to lose.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that you are what your results say you are in racing, but you also are what your team pay you. And that shows you the respect that you have. Aprilia wanted him. They backed up a truck to get him. Same way Yamaha had to do the same to keep Fabio. That's what dictates everything. And at the end of the day, this is also a business. So for the riders, you want to win, you want to do this, that, and the other, but you don't want to be 35 at the end of your career thinking, shit, I need to make some money now. You need to make the money now if you're Jorge Martin. So I think it's one of those situations where it was inevitable what was going to happen for him. But we'll move on to another topic, and pretty much our last topic as well. And it comes down to the age profile that we have in MotoGP and issues with track attendance, because obviously it's one of the big talking points again in Austria about the drop compared to last year. We had a question in from Ignacio Navarro, and he was saying that he had been to Silverstone this year and also in the past he noticed that one of the biggest issues was just the age of the fans, middle-aged or older. Is this the case at all circuits, or is MotoGP or what can MotoGP do to attract younger fans to races?
I think Silverstone in particular is one of the tracks where I think under 14s pay half price or something, which is good, but it's still a lot of money. Tickets are expensive. So, when you go as a family, kids don't go on their own. Kids go as a family. If you go to Aston, there are a lot more kids because kids under 15 get in for free. I think it's really, really important to do that. I think, certainly Silverstone, Assen, Sachsenring, it is mostly, it's more people who look like me than look like Neil. It's very much, it's very much a sort of, older, middle-aged male crowd. That's the profile of the sport in the country. I think one of Liberty's challenges is to change that. If you go to Jerez, if you go to the races in Spain, even if you go to the races in Italy, you see a lot of young people. I do also think that the profile has changed a little bit. Like even Aston, Silverstone, Sachsenring, you're seeing more young people, more kids, more sort of teenagers and people in their early 20s, more women. Really important. It's a really important segment because we're at sort of we seem to be at saturation with males. We need to broaden the audience as much as possible, and I think Liberty here is really going to be what makes the difference in expanding the appeal of what is an absolutely fantastic sport to a much broader audience.
Yeah, I have to say, unfortunately though, Neil, do we still classify not being in the middle-aged bracket at this stage? But I would agree with Neil from what you were saying post Silverstone as well, Neil, about the concerts and the bands and trying to make things more modern, because there's lots of things that, like whenever I've gone to F1 races, they've been massive events. Now you pay for that, it's 500 quid for a ticket. But when the bands there are, like I remember going to Abu Dhabi and it was Jay-Z was playing the gig. You can't imagine things like that happening at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, where I think we had Spandau Ballet one year and things like that. So there's lots of things that are being done to try and attract a crowd, but not in the right area as well. So I think it's one of those things where it will be interesting to see what happens with the Liberty move and if and when that comes through, because that actually brings us, Neil, to a question we had from Mark as well. Just his point of comparison was to a jiu-jitsu event at the weekend that was broadcast on YouTube rather than on the usual pay-per-view model. And one of those situations where they decided to bring it away from their usual model and put it where it was free to air, basically. And they were able to get 100 times their usual viewing figure. It's interesting, actually, because we've done this a few times on Patreon as well, where we've been able to do weekends where our Paddock Notes show, which we have for our Patreon supporters, is available for everyone. And people are able to see what it gets them. And then we get a few extra people to sign on for the next round. If you have something that's behind a paywall and you take it away from that paywall, people do actually see it, see the value of it, and hopefully stick around to get the next, whether it's jiu-jitsu event or the next MotoGP race.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I didn't know that. But I would wager that the Jiu-Jitsu Championship maybe doesn't have as many TV broadcast deals as MotoGP does. And I think, yeah, the big barrier to what that kind of suggestion is would be the broadcaster saying, hey, we're paying you X amount of million euros per year to have the exclusive rights for this in a certain country. And what are you doing putting it solely on YouTube for everyone to watch? I mean, that makes our deal kind of ridiculous. We want the discount. You might get quite a few TV broadcasters saying that. So it's a very tricky thing. I think it's something that Dorna are considering. We had this really starkly shown at the Spanish Grand Prix when I think it was on, I forget the TV station, but it was on one of the terrestrial TV channels in Spain. And, you know, fantastic race. Spain's biggest motorcycle racer fighting against the reigning world champion. You know, there was, I think, more than 1 million viewers watching the race live. And if you compared that to DAZN, the Spanish right broadcaster, it was 100,000 or maybe over 100,000. It was really quite low. So this is a kind of a dilemma that I think Dorna bosses find themselves in. How do they get the product to a kind of greater quantity of people? But then this has been an issue for several years, for many years. It's nothing new, and I think it's something that's happening to lots of sports who are maybe going to have to think about packaging the product in a slightly different way in years to come to try and reach a greater amount of people.
Yeah, it's my understanding that so races in a particular country or are broadcast for free in that country. So, for example, the MotoGP is behind a paywall on Ziggo Sport in the Netherlands, but the Dutch TT was broadcast live on Dutch public broadcaster NOS. We saw that in Silverstone, where it was on ITV4 broadcast for free. Same in Spain. You know, the Spanish Grand Prix is on. Well, was it Telecinco? I can't remember, but it was one of the broadcasters. So, yeah, these things are actually, there is sort of like an opening there, and that is more of a teaser model, if you know what I mean. But I think, you know, the main point is that MotoGP is sort of it's caught in the middle, really. It's too small to, unlike football, always demand a massive audience. But there are enough people who want to pay the broadcasting rights. So sort of it's caught between a rock and a hard place. The broadcasting rights are worth much more behind a paywall than they are with open broadcast, because I know that when I think I can't remember if it was TVE or Telecinco had it on in Spain. Basically, they could not make the money back with advertising for the amount that they were paying. So that was the biggest obstacle.
Yeah, I think it's always one of those things where, for us, MotoGP is the biggest sport, but for everyone else, it's a niche sport within a small sport of motorsport. Yeah. And I think it's always difficult to take yourself outside of where we live and see the size and scale of MotoGP. We've got one question left, and it's another historic question. So I'll come to Neil first, because we haven't heard from you for a few minutes, Neil. DJ Purchase was asking us this question after Dave had mentioned in his roundup that this was a flashback to the 800 era, the Austrian Grand Prix. His question was, which is the most memorable 800 race for you, Neil?
Well, it's quite easy because there's quite a low selection, to be honest.
Which of the 5 races in the 800 era that you actually enjoyed?
It seemed to be, from my memory, it was about an average of 1 great race a year, maybe 2 okay races a year, and then 15 absolute stinkers, which weren't really worth paying a great deal of attention to. That's just my sort of memory of that time period 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago it was now, goodness. But I mean, 3 stand out in my mind. Catalonia.
I'm only asking for 1.
I mean, the obvious ones are Laguna 08 and Barcelona 09, both epic Valentino Rossi victories, but I'm going to go with Catalonia 07 because it was a great showdown between Stoner, Rossi and Pedrosa, and it was the first time where, I mean, Stoner had beaten Rossi in a fair fight a couple of times, but it was never a last lap, no holds barred kind of shootout. And Casey's Ducati that day was so fast on the straight, but it wasn't an easy bike to manhandle through the twisty bits, and there was a lot of twisty bits in Barcelona. And I remember that was the first time that I thought, he's not only possibly going to win this championship, but we're watching like a genuinely great rider here. That was the kind of moment when it dawned just how good Stoner was. So yeah, Barcelona 07 for me, Steve.
What about you, Dave?
I mean, Neil makes a very good point. I mean, look, I loved Barcelona 09. I think it was a fantastic race, but the most memorable has to be Laguna 08. And it wasn't even that great of a race once Casey Stoner fell off, but it was such an important race. Everything was on the line in that race. Valentino Rossi knew that he had to stop Casey Stoner, and he found a way to stop Casey Stoner, whether you think it was fair or not, whether it was clean or not. It was so ruthless. And some of the racing was so fierce that it really sticks in my mind. It was what you wanted to see, where riders were putting everything on the line because winning mattered so much. Surviving didn't matter. They would literally almost die, prefer to die rather than finish second, and that was what made it such an incredible race.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that made it so incredible was the surprise factor, because all practice, I think Rossi had been sandbagging just a little bit, and Stoner had topped every practice session by like a second. And I think he had sort of wiped the floor the previous year at Laguna. So everyone was just thinking, well, this is a foregone conclusion then for Rossi to do what he did. It just kind of took the breath away. So it was, an outstanding race. And it was, the 2 greats of the sport at that time having a proper gloves off tussle, and that's just, no matter what sport you're watching, that's always absolutely essential viewing. So yeah, it's a great shot, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Jerry Burgess about this, and he said they came into that race with just one objective, which was to stay ahead of, just keep ahead of Casey Stoner, do whatever it took to be ahead of Casey Stoner, because they knew that if Stoner got away, especially onto that front straight, it was all over. So Rossi was given one task, one objective: stay ahead of Casey, and then just manage from there. And he did that brilliantly for half a race and forced Stoner into a mistake.
Steve, what about you?
Well, I have to say, I really thought Dave was just going to say the last 800 race, because then we could draw a line under it. But for me, it's actually the first one. And it wasn't a particularly good race by any stretch, but it was a little bit like you, Neil. It was that moment whenever we really got to see just how good Casey was, because back then I was just a fan and I loved watching Casey. Whenever he came on 250s back in 2002 and he had that massive crash on the Aprilia in South Africa, you looked at it and said, I like this guy. He's grabbing it by the scruff of the neck. I think he was like 15 or 16 jumping on a 250 and always looked impressive all the way through the classes. I remember the first GP I went to was at Laguna in 2006 on the big 990. And again, he was the standout for me. And then when we went to Qatar for the first round of the 800 era, you got to see him with a bike that was perfect for him. And that first race actually gave a lot of reason to think that maybe the 800 era could be okay. And it was because the race finished and we had, I think we had 4 different manufacturers inside the top 4. We had, it would have been Stoner, Rossi, Pedrosa, and I think one of the Suzukis was up there, might have been Hopper. And you're looking at it and saying, wow, this change of regulations could really create something special. And then you found out that you're just very naive. And it was special, but not the good kind of special. And it was one of those things that you want to just move past. And then when we went back to the thousands, then suddenly you were able to see the bikes the way you want them to be. And then by that stage, I was in the paddock, you're working as a journalist, and you're able to be much more involved in it. So for me, I'm going to go with Qatar just for that moment when you thought maybe this era could actually be something special, and it ended up being a disaster. But one thing that hasn't been a disaster for us is the use of Patreon for all of these shows. So after every Grand Prix, obviously through the course of this season, we've opened the Wednesday show up for all of our Patreon questions. So sign up on patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast to ask us your questions after each round. You can sign up for a free trial and you're able to see everything that we have on offer on Patreon as well. So maybe before the Aragon Grand Prix on the Wednesday or Thursday, it's worth doing that. It's a 1-week trial, so you can get all of the access to our shows if you sign up as a Paddock Insider on that free trial. So check that out and get your questions in for the next show as well. As it is, big thanks to Fly Racing, to Renthal Street, and Dave, one last shout out to KTM for the Moto Hall and your experience there. Definitely worth going to see for everyone.
Yeah, no, 100%, absolutely worth it. If you are anywhere near it, it's worth it. If you are going to the Red Bull Ring, it's absolutely worth dropping by on the way or on the way back. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, it definitely is. And for us on the Paddock Pass podcast as well, we've got a couple of really cool competitions coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're probably going to drop one of them next week, but for our Patreon supporters, we're going to try and get the news out to them a little bit earlier as well. But on next week's show, we should be able to reveal all about another Paddock Pass podcast competition we have coming up.